And that promise of a book, what for me seemed like, okay, so maybe they finally sort of will look at it and say, something went really wrong with us pursuing those policies and creating those policies and making building difficult. Let us look for a really radical, different alternative to government stepping in into every part of our life and regulating and controlling how and what gets built. They want government leading the way. So a huge part of their theme, I think, is how do you make like a powerful government effective at channeling a collective vision? In this case, a collective vision for abundance.
I think it's not willing to probe to philosophical foundation and to question maybe some of our foundations are wrong. I think if you read the book, the individual is what's missing from the book. There's really no concern at all with what happens to people's individual lives.
America is facing a self-inflicted scarcity due to underbuilding, over-regulation, particularly in the liberal governed area. And the solution is a new agenda called abundance. That is the basic theme or claim of the book called Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson, popular commentators on the left of the political spectrum. The book has immediately become a bestseller, in part because it offers some real grappling with the problems and evils of democratic policies that prevent Americans from building wealth. And in part, it became popular because it promises a positive alternative, or alleges to promise an alternative to the future of the liberal left in the United States, and that alternative should lead to material abundance. As Ayn Rand was, and we here at Ayn Rand Institute are deeply concerned with the future of America. We're concerned with the causes of decline in America in many areas. And we're concerned how policies and culture think about people who build wealth and how they treat the most productive people among us. We decided that it's important to this book and see our take on whether it delivers on its promises. Welcome to Ayn Rand Institute's Bookshelf. I'm Robertas Bakula, and with me today discussing abundance are Onkar Ghate and Tristan de Liège. Hey. So, this discussion of the theme of what we are trying to do in the book, and this abundance agenda, which, if elaborated, is something to the effect of it's both a new approach to policy, but also importantly, and maybe even more importantly, a change in the liberal mindset that focuses on not restricting or creating more difficulty for people to build and create, but actually incentivizing and improving, building and innovating in crucial sectors in the United States, like housing, energy, and infrastructure, three that are the most important in the book. Is that articulation of their agenda and what we're trying to do? Do you agree with my characterization of it? Let's start with you.
I'd put it a little more either widely or fundamentally. I'd bring in some of what they bring up in the conclusion of the book. The conclusion is towards abundance. That's the name of the conclusion. And what they bring up there is the idea that there's a political order, and that there's been two big political orders in the last 80 plus years in America. And part of what they're emphasizing it is that those orders had agreement from both sides of the political ideal, and the way they characterize it, and I think it's useful to think about the way they characterize it. It was the New Deal, that's roughly from the 1930s to the 1970s, and then what they call a neoliberal order from the 1970s to, they put it about to the 2010s. So that's these are roughly 40-year periods. And they characterize the New Deal as having agreement for both the Democrats and the Republicans, the two major political parties in the US, of what we need is intensive or big, grand scale collective action. The New Deal was about the government doing all kinds of things, wielding increased power and control over American society. It's the New Deal and the Great Society with the Johnson, but it's that kind of architecture they're thinking. Like, there was widespread agreement. The government has to do more. It has to play a more active role in political and cultural and economic life of the nation. And then they see neoliberalism as a reaction to that. And they see it as emphasizing individualism. There's an individualist pushback against this collective action and collective power. And they see that both with an obvious figure like Ronald Reagan and the so-called Reagan Revolution. But they put Carter, so the Democrats, that they're on this side too. Carter did a lot of deregulation. Or they put Clinton, where they quote, one of the famous things from Clinton, the era of big government is over. And this was so an individualist pushback that hasn't worked. That is not, the pushback hasn't worked. What neoliberalism has all kinds of problems, failures. It's left us in a kind of predicament. They see it partly as this is the rise, if you understand what the problems are, the rise of political authoritarianism, of a Trump figure, but they'll even put like somebody like a Bernie Sanders, they put it something like the socialist left. They're arising in response to the failures of neoliberalism. And what we need is a different political order. They don't want to go in the direction of political authoritarianism. They think of themselves as opponents of that. So what we need is a different political order arising. One, I would put it as focused on collective action to produce abundance. Something like that is the way that they're thinking about it. I think that's what the book, in a bit like wider frame, that's how they're thinking of what they're doing and what the book's about.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the way they wouldn't put it this way, but I think part of what's telling in the book is that they allude to China as an example a few times, as an example of a government that's very efficient, that gets things done. And I think there's an embrace of government as an ideal of, if we can just get on board with government and we can all agree on a collective vision, then a government is a powerful tool to get things done, and in particular to save us from the crisis of climate change. And again, they wouldn't put it this way, but I think it has what I would consider a fascist sort of overtone of, they want government leading the way. And that's a really important part of the theme. And what's important to them now is that, as Onkar was saying, partly because of neoliberalism and partly because of ways that they think that liberalism has become too procedural, they've made government ineffective. So a huge part of their theme, I think, is how do you make like a powerful government effective at channeling a collective vision? In this case, a collective vision for abundance. That Tristan leads me to sort of the basic product is basically what I felt. I think I read it. When I found it and I saw the description, I started reading it. I felt a promise in the sense of we are really looking at the issues that the democratic government and the liberal policies, which is mostly government heavy involvement in sectors like infrastructure or funding science, or created this incredible amount of rules and regulations and policies that are just impossible to surmount for anyone who wants to build or create something, whether it's affordable housing or whether it's some big research project. It just to go through the process of negotiating with everyone and everything, of getting permits and allowances and going through environmental reviews and going through getting approvals, just lead us to the place where nothing gets built, or whatever gets built unaffordable and expensive. And that promise of a book was, for me, seemed like, okay, so maybe they finally sort of will look at it and say, something went really wrong about pursuing those policies and creating those policies and making building difficult, let us look for a really radical, different alternative to government stepping into every part of our life and regulating and controlling how and what gets built. And yet, the book, as you both were just describing, ended up focusing on heavy emphasis on collective action and empowering and expanding collective action across the board. So I felt like it was a marketing stunt sort of thrown over my head, that I would ever deliver. Do you guys feel similarly, or is your take different?
You want to go, Tristan?
Sure. I am I'm more optimistic than you are about that. I think if you follow, I think following the work of Derek Thompson in other ideas, so he's written a lot about work, about what a post-work society could look like, about how we should think about the role of automation and the role of AI in the future workforce and how that will affect our lives. And then similarly with Ezra Klein, he's more, I think his writing tends to be more focused on, for lack of a better term, political innovation. How do we sort of learn from the failures of, in particular, the Democratic Party, but what he takes to be liberalism more generally, not just in the last election, but in the last few decades. I think that they do have a genuine concern for the long-term outlook of liberalism as an ideology and how it needs to evolve. And I think they do believe that we are in a moment of crisis and that there needs to be some kind of evolution of ideology. I think the problem, and we'll get to the problems that are fundamentally facing the book and their framing, but I think a big problem from our perspective is that they don't understand or they don't have a rational perspective on the nature of government and the nature of government force. And they have the perspective, I think Onkar is really right to point to the New Deal, because the framing of their perspective is we want to go back to a sort of older form of liberalism that they thought was successful in the early 20th century, where people had a greater agreement on a collective vision. People were more collectivistic. And they think that there's a way to get back to that. There's a way to make the government more efficient at pursuing that collective vision, but they want government leading the way. And they think that the transformation of the liberal ideology is what's needed to fit that. And they think we've had too much individualism, actually. And I think they honestly believe that. So I think they are capturing a moment, because a lot of liberals now are ripe for a reframing. People are shocked that Trump was reelected. And a lot of liberals are thinking there's something really wrong with how we're thinking about policy, what we're focused on in terms of our priorities. And so I think it's a ripe moment that they've chosen for this book, but I have a more optimistic take that I think they genuinely believe that liberal ideology needs to change.
Yeah, I'm probably somewhere in between you two. So I think there's a genuine attempt at soul searching here and trying to get the liberals. So this is a book, they're self-confessed liberals, and they say who they're basically writing for is their fellow liberals, to try to convince them we need to reorient in a significant way. I think they probably think in a radical way, but my perspective is no, it's not in a radical way. And putting that a little differently, it's in an unphilosophic way. So they're unwilling to question any of their fundamental philosophic assumptions. so they think something's gone wrong, and I think people will learn things about the problems that they're pointing out, and we'll talk about some of the problems that they're pointing out. Now, I knew most of this, what's in the book, so I didn't find it that particularly interesting, but some of it's well explained. Like take one negative thing and one positive thing that they're, I mean, in their terms, what they're thinking of as a negative, what they're thinking of as a positive. The incredible difficulty of building housing, like personal single-family apartment buildings, housing in the United States. There's a lengthy discussion of the many problems, many of them government created or intensified about that. And like I'm putting it in the context of the problem with homelessness. And why is it worse in Democratic-run cities than in Republican-run cities? And it's some of the policies, like we liberals, policies that we've been putting in place, maybe not with the intent of increasing or exacerbating homelessness, but that's the result. And so there's discussion of that. On the part of something I think it was a positive, Operation Warp Speed, the development of the COVID vaccine. And then there's a lengthy discussion of how that happened. So there's a sort of thinking about government functioning and processes and rules and goals that they're pursuing. That's part of the meat of the book. And problems they're pointing out, there often are real problems, not always, but they're often real problems. I don't always agree with the analysis of just what the problem is, and I certainly don't agree with the solution. And this is the sense in which I think it's not willing to probe to philosophical foundations and to question maybe some of our foundations are wrong. So there's I put it, to echo what Tristan said, that I think of these as the same thing. It's an unwillingness to really think about the issue of when something is done voluntarily and when something is done coercively. When someone you've persuaded them to embark on a certain journey, and when you force them to go on the journey, whether they like it or not. And they think of government as, well, it's a form of cooperation, but it's not a voluntary form of cooperation. When we're talking about particularly, like, let's have this government program to increase housing. And they even bring up some of the distortions in the housing market were partly encouraged and created by government. And they don't think of that as, well, we're forcing people against their will to do something. And is that right or not? It's just, well, that's one form of cooperation. And what happens in a market when you go into a business and buy an iPhone, well, that's another form of cooperation. But they're not two forms of cooperation. One is voluntary and the other is forced. And you have to have a radical distinction between these. And part of the liberal mindset is not to have any kind of distinction like that. And they just double down. It's almost like they're oblivious to it, but I don't think they can be fully oblivious to it. And the other aspect of which this is the same thing is every solution is collectivistic. And I think if you read the book, the individual is what's missing from the book. There's really no concern at all with what happens to people's individual lives. And to take one example of that comes up in the book, because they bring it up, the space program and the moon landing. And they bring up that there was, like, we think of it now as a great success and look what government did. At the time, the polls were people are not in favor of it. And one of the things that the polls that they quote, are you in favor of going to the moon at any cost? At any cost. That was what the poll, and people said no. Like, it's, and in the book it's kind of like, that's weird. And they like the fact that government pushed ahead nevertheless. People were opposed to it, and they pushed ahead nevertheless because, well, obviously it was good to land on the moon. And they think of it as, yeah, the government paid for it. But no, it's individual people, taxpayers paid for it. And what you're really asking them, like, do you want your tax money to go to land a person on the moon, or do you want it to get it to, like, safer streets? If you're thinking like in the 60s and 70s when crime is starting to rise. And they're just oblivious to that. Like, it's, oh, but this is all we doing it. And this is a collectivized mindset. Ayn Rand has a very interesting article called Collectivized Ethics. And if you read that, I think it gets to a T the mentality one's dealing with here. And that's a mentality that doesn't really see individuals and the cost to individual lives, which in the end is the only real cost. They just see collectivized action as though it sort of happens in a vacuum. And this comes up in the book of people saying, well, the reason why young innovators, entrepreneurs are going into the tech world and not into, say, construction, is that, well, it's impossible to construct anything in the US. And that's part of what they're focused on housing, but they bring up, there's other things that they're bringing up in terms of how difficult it is to build things, physical things in the US. But it's never put as this is a restriction on people's freedom or a restriction on their rights that they have, should have, that they have under the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and it's been deprived by both the New Deal and what came afterward. I think the only mention of freedom comes in the conclusion, and it's in terms of, well, there was something good about the New Deal presenting itself about securing the four freedoms, and then the neoliberal order puts it also in terms of freedom, and we probably, to have a new political order, have to put it in terms of freedom, because that's what's resonant in the American mind. But they don't really think in terms of freedom, which means the freedom of the individual. And so to think of the housing versus Silicon Valley, for both, they think the government in significant part should be setting the goals. Like the goal, we need more housing. We need to take on China in so-called renewable energy. So the government has to set, like, this is a major goal. And they think of, like, the difference is, yeah, but in housing, even with that goal, well, one, it's the goal is not clear. But even if it was clear, there's so much regulation and red tape that people couldn't pursue it. And in something like the tech world, it's easier to pursue things. But part of what attracts people to the tech world is that the government's not telling them what to do. And it's not telling them in both ways. It's not telling them, well, you have to run your business in this way or that way. And it's not telling them what your goal is. It's not like the government would say, oh, you create a social media company and you create a vast networking company and you engage in internet search. And then so it tells Google and Apple and Microsoft and so on, like, these are Meta, these are your basic goals, now go and execute. And they don't seem to have any recognition of, yeah, like, that's part of what attracts people to the one versus the other. And it's so if we could get rid of some of these regulations, red tape, the perverse ways some of this is financed, government could set the goal and it would be, we get what we want. That is the collective we, the people sort of running the government who voted them in, they can get what they want. And that's not a real conception of, so both the problem and then what the solution is. Like, the problem is a lack of freedom. And like something like zoning is a massive violation of people's rights. That it's the people who've moved into an area and now they did what they wanted with their property, built what they want, and now they're going to tell everybody else, no, you can't build a factory, you can't build an apartment building, you can't rent to lower income people, and so on. People didn't tell them that when they built, but now they think that somehow they've got that power because they live in the area and they don't have a proper conception of rights and freedom. They don't have that power, and it's a problem that the government has in effect granted them that kind of veto power.
I certainly fundamentally agree with all of that. And just to, I think, add one just additional derivative issue that I think is related to that. If we're thinking about Silicon Valley, is people want to do work that they're excited about and not things that they're forced to do or told by other people to do. And they want to be rewarded for it. And that's part of what's not explored in this book is like part of the point of private enterprise is people want to be rewarded for their work. They want to be rewarded for their investment, and they want to be rewarded for taking risks. And the whole way that the book is framed is it takes, as Onkar put it, it takes for granted, like, well, the government goals are good, and the overall goals that we're setting are good, and we just have to get people on board with these goals, and make it more efficient for them to pursue them. But well, what about like people that just want to, like innovate and create new products, whether it's in medicine or in housing, and be rewarded for it? And just to take an anecdote, I've personally known people who left architecture just because it's so difficult to innovate in architecture. And part of what people want to do when they innovate in architecture is they want to come up with ways to solve problems that aren't being solved and then be rewarded for it. But that requires operating in a free market. That's not achieved by, asking for federal grants or going through public housing projects. And that's something that is completely glossed over from the book. And part of the reason is they don't want to put the focus on the individual perspective. They want to frame everything as collective action, collective problems that have collective solutions.
I think it's pretty telling and important that the book starts the sort of utopian vision, in a sense that they come out immediately and they say, this is the future that we want. And I think on the authors that Eric Thompson and Ezra Klein, we want this type of energy and not this type of energy, like renewable energy, fusion, nuclear, but not fossil fuels. We want everybody to have access to drugs of longevity and equal medicine and education, and everybody has a house and apartment that we like, and this is the future that we want. And our agenda is, the book kicks off immediately, this is our agenda of how to achieve what we want. And again, there's no mention of, but what about the people who are gonna to provide it for you, and who are to build and create and make that stuff that you want? That doesn't come up in the book. What comes up in the book is just that, yeah, we need those people in our fields, in the field that we deemed in our utopian vision to be necessary and to be foundational to the future. So if I was really uncharitable, I would say, yeah, they treat the builders and the creative producers as a herd that's out there, and that we just need to somehow attract them to our field rather than field out there that we care about. And I find at least despicable in a mindset towards the people that their own goals rely on.
Yes, there's for sure a way in which, if you're going to obliterate the individual, that if you don't really see them, and I think they don't really see the individual, then the individual becomes the means to collective ends, because the only people who are actually acting in an economy are individual people making individual individual decisions, engaging in individual transactions. And that's the means that you're going to try to use to pursue your ends. And I, in the end, have a pretty negative view of the book and the proposals for this reason of how collectivistic it is, how much it ignores the individual. And to give some aspects of this So you put it as it's sort of their goals, their vision, what they want, and they think everybody else either wants this or should want this, and the should means, well, they might not all agree, but hopefully we can get enough people to agree and force everybody else. And if you just take this is one, but there's other examples, and we'll come back to some when we talk about some other aspects of the argument in the book. The environmental aspect. So it's true, and this is better than the norm probably with liberals. There's some recognition that, yeah, there's been anti-growth policies and sort of an anti-growth vision that comes into existence in the 70s with environmentalists and the environmental movement. And it's had, though they go out of their way to praise, it's done all kinds of great things. It's helped way reduce pollution and so on. It's also caused some problems, and this is part of what has made our ability to grow difficult. There's so many, you brought up, I think, earlier, environmental reviews that add years, if not decades, to projects, which make them super costly and often just impossible. They never finish. They're never brought to completion. And they bring up the concerns and worries about that. But they also, and so the better aspect, so that's one good aspect. And then this has happened to nuclear. And nuclear power in the United States is a dead industry. That's not true all over the globe. And they bring up, for instance, France, which gets a significant portion of its generates a significant portion of its electricity through nuclear. But their focus in the book is not, we've got to build more nuclear. It's we've got to build more solar energy. And if you ask what's the difference, if you cut all the bogus regulations, safety concerns in regard to nuclear, and there was so much irrational demonization in the 70s and on of nuclear, that a nuclear plant's going to explode and is like a bomb and we don't know what to do with the waste, and so all things that were not truth, that were meant to demonize it. And if you really think all that, well, then we have to have 10-year studies about nuclear and watchdogs on it, and then it becomes uneconomical to build nuclear plants. But if you didn't have that, it would be economical to build nuclear, or likely would be. In some of the evidence in other countries, they build it and it's profitable to run these things. Solar's not profitable, which is why it has to be subsidized by the government. And what they're pushing for is subsidizing it, more research into it. We've got to get the government to make us, or make the economy, but the economy is just a whole bunch of individuals, adopt solar, because you wouldn't choose to adopt it. Whereas you might choose to adopt nuclear if people were free to build. But that's not their focus. Their focus is on the things that require coercion, require forcing people to do it, because they wouldn't do it voluntarily. And that runs through the book, that they're always on the things that require that you force other people to do them, because you can't persuade them to do them. Whereas you could persuade people to adopt nuclear. And so this is both like a disagreement about the full analysis of the problem. They're right about like some of the things about nuclear and concerns with it and so on, but fundamentally they don't really understand, I think, what is going on. And so the solutions they're adopting it's not a solution of, yeah, what we really need is freedom. It's no, we need different government controls so that we can get solar. And right now, solar in the US is very hard to build. And so what we need to do is make it so government can build solar. We need to free people so that they can produce profitable energy.
So for somebody, and the audience of the book are the liberals, like you, Onkar, pointed out, and they're not really directly talking to, let's say, people who are more on a individualist or more on a free market and freedom sort of camp, if you will. But there is this suspicion, almost like a rational reader, I think, would go through the problems, reading through the problems that they're pointing out in the book, through the government policies, the reviews, everything that we just talked about. And the rational reader would be asking, okay, so why the alternative is not deregulation, more freedom in the markets, more freedom to the individuals, or like the free to allow capitalism and the free market to work as they have proven time and time again through recent history to advance the goals that we want, to advance more affordability, more goods, more energy, more availability to everyone, all the things of the values that Klein and Thompson want them to have. But there is this suspicion in the book that, and almost like hand waving, that the market is not the solution of the problem. Maybe sometimes it is. So if they would say, and that's a direct quote, if the regulation produces more housing, yes, then deregulate. If building more social housing produces more housing, then build more social housing. And quote. So their approach is sort of this pragmatic, really care for the philosophy that you take, whether it's a free market or the government building. Why not both? We want the goal. Let's see what achieves that goal. But the market itself, the goals that we want, the affordable housing, the equal access to energy and plentiful, abundant energy. It's the market it's taken for granted in the book that it doesn't provide it. It doesn't give it to them. It has to be at least nudged, regulated, or sometimes some things have to be completely banned from the free market because they don't fit their goals. So I want to hear from both of you, why do you think of this suspicion and sort of hand-waving of free market and freedom as, yeah, this is not the solution. We really need to spend that much time on that even.
So I think a big part of the framing of the book is climate change and what they take to be a climate crisis. And I think a background for their readers, because they don't actually talk about the climate change a lot directly, but I think a background assumption for their readers is we're facing this huge collective problem that is at least largely or partially caused by capitalism, or depending on who you ask, like fully by capitalism. And so I think part of the background context for them is we have this collective problem that clearly free markets can't save, because if we let people, for example, just use whatever energy sources they want, people will keep using fossil fuels. People won't want to radically change, to mainly using electricity and mainly using renewable electricity. And they do talk about that a bit at the beginning of the book. But I think in terms of like why it can't be the free market, that's just a background assumption that's part of what's led to this global problem. And then I think they also think that when you look at specific cases, so for example, they talk about innovation in solar energy, and they talk about how, it's the government subsidizing it in every case is what has helped it get more efficient. That you can't just wait for people to change their behavior to radically change how they're consuming energy. And from that perspective, it feeds into their narrative that what's required is buying into this collective vision. And I think the flavor of it is that you can't trust free markets. Maybe, as you put it, sometimes for them it can be a tool of efficiency, but you always have to have the ability to step in with government oversight. And so there is a deep pragmatism that runs through the book. But ultimately, I think ultimately they want the government to have control over the direction of innovation, the direction of the new kinds of energy that we're going to use and how we build things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here. What Tristan's bringing up about that this is framed in the book is framed in terms of we want to be able to address climate change. They put that explicitly. Like, this is one of our main reasons for writing this book. And I would put it as the way I think of it, and to echo what I said earlier about it's not a philosophic book, and in some ways it's unphilosophic. Like, it's unwilling to question any deep assumption. I would put they're conventional in regard to climate change, and they're conventional in regard to markets. So everybody knows that markets don't really work. You couldn't leave them unregulated. You couldn't have laissez-faire. And they quote Keynes in a book against laissez-faire about this. They just think, like, everybody knows this. We don't need to go there. We don't need to revisit that. Now, there's more going on about their distrust of markets, and we can come back to it. And I want to make a point about there's things in the book that should make them question assumptions that they're unwilling to question. And the issue about markets and the power of markets is one. But in regard to climate change, we all know this is an imminent disaster. Not that there's going to be there's going to be problems, there's going to be things people have to adapt to. There's going to be changes, just as there's been changes in the past. There's going to be changes in the future, and it's not as though climate is stable. There's there's all kinds of agriculture shifts, migration shifts, and so on. It's that we can't adapt to it. And so we need the government to drastically intervene, because you couldn't adapt through free actions of people coming to see, oh yeah, like, it's harder to grow here. Maybe I should plant something else, or we should move to another state to farm. And so you can't have that adaptation. But so it has to be that it's a crisis, but you can't really take that seriously. They're proposing this as a kind of solution. There's no way this solution can be adopted. They want to change in mindset and so on. That can be adopted if this has to be adopted in 5 years, or we're all finished and we're at a point of no return. And their perspective, I brought up the renewables and nuclear from a certain perspective. And it was a perspective about, they don't think at all about what's profitable and what's not. That's not a big issue for them. They make this kind of claim, and you've probably heard this often from environmentalists. Renewables will outcompete everything, including fossil fuels. And they quote one expert who says, well, solar energy, the cost of solar energy will be effectively zero in 2030. That's 5 years from now. The cost will be effectively zero. If that were true, you would put the fossil fuel industry out of business. Like, if you could really get zero cost energy, why are people going to use costly fossil fuels and so on? So there's a perspective of, oh, this will just outcompete. But then we wouldn't have the problem as they see it. The whole problem is, no, these are super expensive. We don't even know if we can get to the scale we can with renewables and so-called clean energy, but we have to, because we're all going to be wiped out if we don't, or we're going to be like thrust into new dark ages if we don't. And those perspectives, like, you can't have both of those perspectives of what is going on, and they don't grapple with that of, like, what they're really saying. And that's the sense in which this isn't real thinking about solutions and what is going on. This is too much. These are the things we like, and this is part of what you're really bringing up, Roberta, is that it's like, these are the things we like. We like solar, we don't like nuclear, we certainly don't like fossil fuels. So what we want to do is engineer the economy so that we get renewables, and maybe on the margins nuclear, and we get rid of fossil fuels. And it's too much sort of that central planner's mentality that we know what's really good. And like, they're worried about the political environment in which people are looking down on elites. And they even recognize, like, there's some legitimacy to why people are looking down on elites. They bring up the COVID response, and that people would be suspicious of their leadership and so on. But they don't have any qualms about thinking, like, we're going to tell everybody what the basic goals are. And like, that's not an elitist perspective of like, we set the goals and then we're going to try to engineer society so that we get the goals that we know are good. And for they don't think of that as, well, that isn't that part of the elitist mentality that people are rebelling against?
Right. And one additional point, what I found interesting, like you said, they're taking a lot for granted. And the assumption about climate is like, we're facing this crisis and we don't need to talk about it because our reader is on board with us. And what I found really interesting is that there was no even acknowledgement or mention at all, maybe in a footnote or somewhere, of a contrasting view. I presume that anybody really dealing with that issue of energy issue would at least maybe mention that there is a view, like, let's say, Alex Epstein's from Fossil Future, but the future of energy, that if we really care about abundance, and that energy poverty is one of the most fundamental problems now facing humanity, is you have only to acknowledge that there is a view that the only way to pursue or achieve energy abundance is to look at the future full of more usage of fossil fuels, not less, and all the data and research that someone like Alex Epstein brings in. And there is no mention of that, even though the cover of a book, that's an interesting point, looks very similar to the fossil future, and it's just similar.
And notice that they activate a bunch of things in regard to this, but don't put it together at all, and don't even like try to work to like, how does this all fit together? So they see themselves as, we're super pro energy. We need a ton more energy. And they bring up rightly that in the so-called third world, their per capita, like their energy, their ability to produce energy is so low, and that's why they're, relatively speaking, impoverished. So they see themselves as super pro energy. You need it for everything, including coping with climate. You need it for heating and to be able to cook, and to be able to cook without pollution and so on. But the idea that, well, okay, so maybe if we had more energy, including fossil fuel energy, that even if, there's changes in the climate as a result, the energy will so swamp the problems that we'll be able to deal, just as we deal now with climate and living in places that are too hot or too cold. We use energy to heat our homes or to air condition them. Like, that's what we would do. But there's no, like, that's not been raised as a possibility to argue against, and it's just, and this is the conventional aspect. It's like, we all know the climate change is a catastrophe that's impossible to address, to adapt to. That's just taken for granted. So they can see themselves as pro energy, but that has nothing to do with being able to cope with climate.
Interesting aspect, in now shifting to housing a little bit, the same. In the book, they talk a lot. Look at like Houston and Austin, and look how much they built, and the housing is so much more affordable, and there's so many more permits and allowances for building, and therefore the homelessness is radically on the opposite side, that if almost non-existent compared to California. And that because either the zoning laws or the building codes are much more lax or non-existent, or the getting the permits and allowances is much easier. But nowhere in the book really, and maybe I'm missing that, maybe you guys can correct me, but there is no step of why is that not enough? Why is it not enough to remove, and they would say, yes, remove the regulations, the zoning laws and the building codes that prevent building, and make it more like Houston rather than more like San Francisco. But there is no sort of cashing in on that idea of what that means philosophically, in the sense of, well, okay, so what government involvement, or non-involvement more correctly, leads to the goal to the goals that they presumably want to pursue. And they still then focus on the conclusion of the book, we need more of a collective action solution rather than just allow the markets to work and the people to build.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think philosophically, it's I think this is a reformulation of what Onkar said, but just in light of what you just said, I think part of the reason that they can't be philosophical, I think, is because of these contradictions, in a sense. So it would undermine their thesis, for example, if they were to identify a philosophical distinction between coercion and cooperation or collaboration. And it's crucial to their ideology that you can shift between, well, you talk about individuals inventing things and in a free market context, and then you talk about the government funding things. It's just different ways of like pursuing research and different ways of inventing things, and you have to be able to blur those boundaries. And similarly, shifting between the perspective of, oh, there's a crisis, and so we need to act collectively, versus this is like a long-term change to our ideology. And I think there is, and maybe to the extent that there's a less than honest or less than like a rigorous kind of self-reflection that's going on in the book, I think it's there that they're shifting these perspective when it suits them in order to be able to maintain their basic assumptions, namely the basic liberal assumptions that government is a fundamentally good tool for like promoting values that we care about, and it's fundamentally a cooperative tool. It's not a coercive tool, and that requires them to be able to like shift across these perspectives whenever they're getting too close to, as Onkar put it, like activating another perspective or a contrasting perspective.
Well, I want to go back to the issue of free markets. I don't know, and so it goes to the heart of what I think is going on in the book, as I've said, and we've just been talking about, and Tristan was just talking about that they don't differentiate between voluntary agreements, contracts, cooperation, and coercive government action where you're doing something against people's will. And there are instances where the government should and does things against people's will. When you put somebody in prison and they say, well, no, I don't want to go to, but you're doing it against their will, but you're using coercion against people who introduced the use of coercion or force. If it's a proper government, you're putting the person in prison because he stole something or beat up somebody or killed somebody. He's the one who introduced the use of coercion in society. He's the one who's no longer behaving as a peaceful person. But a peaceful person means you seek other people's agreement and cooperation voluntarily. And if you can't get it, you go your separate way. You don't rob them or beat them up. And so the government does do things and has to do things against people's will, but it should not do so in the economic realm against peaceful people. That's partly why I think in the end, the proper view of government is there should be a separation of economy and state, just as there should be in church and state. You don't beat up people or force them into a religion when they disagree, and you don't make them do things economically when they think, no, it's not worth doing this, and it's not in my interest, it's not profitable for me to do this. You either convince them that it is, or you have to go your separate way. And they don't want to do that, which is partly why they'll just elude the difference between voluntary cooperation and coercion. And it goes to the very heart of the framing of the book, and that they don't really press on this, even though they're aware of it. And this is something that comes up in the introduction and then the conclusion. When they're trying to get you to imagine if we had a political order that's focused on abundance. And now I'm going to put it a little differently, and this is an important difference, because abundance is sort of the result, and it's a collectivistic perspective. We all have a bunch of things. If you focused it on production and individual production, what they activate, and let me read this. This is from the introduction. This is on page 11, according to the Kindle. They activate late 19th century America. And this is what they say. Imagine going to sleep in 1875 in New York City and waking up 30 years later. As you shut your eyes, there is no electric lighting, Coca-Cola, basketball, or aspirin. There are no cars or sneakers. The tallest building in Manhattan is a church. When you wake up in 1905, the city has been remade with towering steel skeleton buildings called skyscrapers. The streets are filled with novelties. Automobiles powered by new internal combustion engines, people riding bicycles and rubber-soled shoes, all recent innovations. The Sears catalog, the cardboard box, and aspirin are new arrivals. People have enjoyed their first sip of Coca-Cola and their first bite of what we now call an American hamburger. The Wright brothers have flown the first airplane. When you passed into slumber, nobody had taken a picture with a Kodak camera or used a machine that made motion pictures or bought a device to play recorded music. By 1905, we have the first commercial versions of all three: the simple box camera, the cinematograph, and the phonograph. Oh, I mispronounced that, but leave that. Close quote. If that was, in essence, and they know this, in essence, all the achievements of private individuals in voluntary transactions to commercialize and make profits. Kodak, Coca-Cola, these became some of the biggest, most profitable companies in America. That's what actual productivity and progress looks like. It's individuals innovating, producing, entering into agreements and companies and voluntary cooperation with other people. And it's true, like what the point they're making, that if you fell asleep, if like this could happen, you fell asleep, like I were in a coma for 30 years, 1875, and you woke up in 1905, the world would look really different. And the progress and productivity would be astonishing. It's all privately done in essence. And yet their solution is government has to drive all of this. And they come back to this in the conclusion where they sort of openly admit, yeah, like this used to be done all without government. But after World War II, it's all done with government. And for some reason, they think that's a better thing. And it's way worse. They're not even comparable. And things like, to take two examples that can sound like, oh, this is like Coca-Cola and the Wright brothers and Kodak and cameras and so on, but it's a very, very different thing. And this is the difference between the voluntary and coerced. Two of the things that they bring up very favorably are the interstate highway system and the moon landing. Both of these are the result of coercion, and they're both dramatically bad. The interstate highway system was only seemingly needed because the governments destroyed the railroads. I don't think, from an economic perspective, if you were looking at people's individual lives, individual transactions, what they found beneficial for their lives, there's no way you would have the interstate highway system that you have in the US today. It's too big. It's too expensive to maintain. You would have, and this is one of the things, they want high-speed rail. You would have real profitable high-speed rail connecting the company, because over these vast differences, it doesn't make sense economically for everybody to get into cars and to pay for the interstate highway system through taxes. They have a big thing too about, like, our cities they're not as vibrant as cities elsewhere in the world. The interstate highway system is a vast transfer of money from cities to more rural areas, because you have to build all these highways that connect people that live in 1,000, 2,000 person city. And in the era of the railroads, when it was privately done, it would be a thing like, is it profitable to build a rail line to this place? And no, it's not, and we're not going to. And it was a big thing. Oh yeah, like our town is getting a railroad in the station here because it's seen as, yeah, this might be profitable to do this. Like, this might be economically useful to do this. And the moon landing is that on steroids, that it's like, economically, would you spend all of this money? It's not at all like the radio or the camera, which was benefiting people's individual lives. When you couldn't convince this, and they know this because they bring it up, you couldn't convince people this will benefit your actual life, but you should do it anyway, and we should make you do it. And they just treat these as they're exactly the same thing, and they're radically different. But you only see that radical difference if you understand one's voluntary. So people thought of this as, this is making my life better, and the other's coerced, and you tell them, oh yeah, the moon landing makes your life better, but they don't think so. And it doesn't matter that they don't think so. We're going to override that judgment. And those are not the same phenomena.
Yeah, just to add to the moon landing point, another part of what's contradictory and not self-reflective and shows the way in which the book is not philosophical is they're not grappling with the question of, well, why didn't people support the moon landing, and like why, did they have a good reason for not supporting it, and why did NASA stagnate so much, and why were the costs so high? And they even bring up SpaceX and the fact that they're aware of like the recent innovations in private space exploration and the way that they've been able to bring costs down. And again, it's a case where they're activating a context of the question that we should be asking is like, well, why was there this unpopular thing that didn't really make any economic sense at all? And why are we supposed to look at that as an achievement? And when SpaceX and Blue Origin are now like reducing costs and making space flight more economic, making more innovation possible, we have nothing to say about that. And there's no view of like, oh, this is a fundamentally different thing, and it's operating by a different mechanism, namely it's voluntary and it's private initiative and it's not by force. And I think in the end, it requires, from a philosophical perspective, it requires a kind of elitism or a sort of an intrinsic value approach that I think is in the background of the book, and one of its most fundamental flaws is that you can't ask the question of like, are these goals good? If the whole view was, well, we can prove to you rationally that like you should adopt these goals, then you wouldn't need coercion to do them. And so there's a whole background framework, I think, of the book that the reason you can't have markets and the reason you need to empower government to execute this collective vision is because if you leave people alone, they will just create more problems. They will worsen the climate crisis, and they won't pursue the right goals. They won't pursue the things that are truly valuable. And that's the only way that their perspective can work. Otherwise, you can't make sense of the way in which they're glossing over the achievements of individuals and not asking like why those matter.
To follow up on this question of innovation a little bit, before we started the conversation, Onkar, I asked you that question. I would like you to, if you can say a little more on that. So from the book, there's quite a bit of many examples that they bring up of innovations and technologies that they claim are a direct result of the government either funding the research or being directly leading the research and development or directing the project. That's from space projects that you just discussed, Tristan, and to things like internet or personal computers or semiconductors or self-driving vehicles. They go through lists of technologies that they claim are a direct result either of government involvement in that science and research and development, or at least a partnership and support of that with the private individuals and innovators. And the sort of the implicit, or maybe sometimes even an explicit claim, is that none of those would be possible. You, Tristan, talked about penicillin, and the framing in the book is, yeah, while it was the individual dealing with penicillin, a decade went by and nothing really happened before government stepped in the Second World War and made it widely available and developed it to the extent that it became actually useful. So, Onkar, I'll start with you, but Tristan, I want to hear from you too. What do you make of this claim, and how do you think about government's involvement in science and all the technologies and achievements that they or many people reading them can associate with a government? And what would the counterfactual, if you will, what would that have happened? How can you think about it if the government was not involved in that process?
Yeah, so there's a lot to say here, just in terms of some of the argument in the book, and to go back to what I brought up in terms of that they point to the late 19th century in America and then come back to that. They also point to the praising of Edison, who they think of, it wasn't just an inventor, but how do you get some invention to the point that it's useful and marketable, but that means like you can have a market that's profitable for it. And they have a certain perspective like this was good that Edison had this kind of attitude. So the things that they pointed to in the late 19th century, there's a lot of innovation here, that scientifically, technologically, and then bringing it all the way to getting profitable marketing. If you think like the Wright brothers, it's some better understanding of the way flight works to all kinds of engineering and technology. Like how do we get something that can actually fly? And then you get in the years and decades that follow the commercialization of this, but they too have an interest in that. This all happened privately with private investors and so on, thinking of like what is going to be the future, and we want to help fund it because we want a profitable future in which people are growing and cooperating in new developments voluntarily. Then they bring up that after World War II, and it's true that World War II was a massive change, that the government became involved in all kinds of areas of U.S. life and did not retreat from all of them, and particularly for economic areas, said, we're going to keep this kind of control, we'll change it to more a kind of peacetime focus and so on, but it's once it got this kind of power, a lot of it did not give up in various ways. And so it's now the government becomes the major funder of scientific research, and they have a lot of criticism of the government funding of science as it's now come. They have a lot. They think it to take one of the things that they are like really focus on. They think that the grant making is super risk averse, cautious. You give to established people with established views and theories. You won't take any chance on the young person with a relatively unconventional idea, and so they have said like it's really gone wrong. But it's not even really a question of, well, maybe this was because government got involved in scientific research. Like maybe that's the problem. No, that can't be the problem. It's just the way that it's being done is the problem. So we have to re-engineer how it's being done. But it's not that, oh, well, we used to have government wasn't pre-World War II involved in this way in research. And by their own admission, it's like we had incredible innovation when that wasn't the case. But they won't really think about that. And then it's a common collectivist kind of argument to not distinguish between things that a market would do because they actually could be profitable and so on. So it would exist if government weren't doing it, and things that a market wouldn't do. And a market just means like individuals a market's not a thing in that sense, and like an actor. It just means the individuals in the economy would not do it because they can't figure out any way to make it profitable and valuable to the people who were actually be paying for it and so on. So it doesn't happen. So that there's the argument, and they bring it up even with Elon Musk, they bring it up with the internet, and so that, well, without some government research and science, which now the government's like the major funder of all this. The internet wouldn't exist, Elon Musk's companies wouldn't exist, and so on. It's the same argument, and I've had collectivists make this argument to me that, well, there's no such thing really as individual achievement, because somebody paid for that person's schooling in elementary school and high school and university. This is subsidized by the government, so it's a government achievement. And I think the proper perspective on that is, yeah, it's subsidized and paid for and controlled by the government, but it would exist, and it would exist in a better way in a free market. It's not like, oh, there wouldn't be education in a free market. There wouldn't be private education. You need the government to say, well, no, look, education's good, it's valuable, it's productive, so we have to have schools. And when you look at the history of America, there were plenty of private schools when the value and nature of education was better understood, and people wanted to get educated. It's not like you need the government to do it. But you wouldn't have things like the moon landing, because people couldn't figure out, well, how do we pay for that? And even if it was like charities, there wasn't probably enough charitable money that they would say, yeah, we're going to put our billions in charity into a moon landing versus other things they could do. So it wouldn't exist on a private market. And from their perspective, and this is echoing what Tristan was saying, that there's a kind of intrinsic, says, well, obviously a moon landing is good. And if a market wouldn't produce it, that's something defective about a market. But that's not, and then they run the same, well, government education's good. And if a government weren't doing it, the market wouldn't do it. But yeah, a market would do education and wouldn't do a moon landing. And that's something good about the way markets function, but they view it as something bad.
So the last thing I sort of want to bring up about this, and it's the relevance of China as an example, or even, if you will, an exemplary model in their book. And I say that not lightly, because through the book, as you go through issues, when we talk about high-speed rail, how California spent 3 decades and wasted billions and couldn't build one rail, and meanwhile, China is building networks of high-speed rail. Or housing. Well, the housing is severe. We are in a severe crisis and shortage of housing, especially in cities like San Francisco, let's say, compared to plentiful housing that China is building. And like issue after issue through the book, there is this nod to look at China as a model. The model there is that whenever the government takes on a big project like that, like a high-speed rail or a housing project, it doesn't need to deal with all these processes that we, the Democrats, sort of self-imposed on us. Environmental reviews, dealing with stakeholders, looking not in my backyard people, negotiating for land, and thinking about accountability and in terms of like documentation, where the money is spent and stuff. China's government doesn't care for any of that, and it built. And yeah, there is 2 words in the book that it sort of leads to some power and imperiousness, they say. But that's it. That's all the acknowledgement of what kind of government and life there is in China. There is zero, and that was very frustrating to me. There is zero grappling that power that they sort of look at China's government and admire, in a sense, or doing the projects that they would like to have done in the United States, comes with the same power to oppress the individual and completely eliminate his freedom and voice in his life. There is no grappling with the fact that, yes, China is building a lot of housing, and there is a bunch of ghost towns where people either can't afford or are not allowed to live. There is no grappling with what kind of life you live when you cannot really speak, when you cannot really trade, when you cannot really choose your life. They in the book, they sort of have a positive nod to that meritocracy system of how you get a government position in China through tests and through exams. And there is no thought added that what that creates legitimacy to the government that then takes the people who are ambitious or maybe would like to oppose a government, but the only way for them to get in is to through the tests and through this authoritarian system of like, if you want to be in our party, go through this process and be a part of the gang. So this complete unwillingness or maybe I don't know, ignorance of what kind of life an individual lives in a country like China versus what kind of a life an individual lives even in the places that they criticize, California or San Francisco, and where the individual would prefer to live if you gave him a choice. There's no thinking in that. I find that extremely frustrating, and that positive nod to the Chinese model, to the life in China and Chinese government, and then to Karl Marx as a foundation to that. The saying, yeah, Marx got some things wrong, but what are those things? And that some of those things led to millions of deaths across the world and history. They don't find it necessary to even acknowledge. So that one of the main frustrations that I had from the book is what's not said in it, and what's purposefully or from ignorance avoided in it.
Yeah, I'll just say I found it more than frustrating. Maybe you're trying to downplay it. That there's something really wrong for anybody who uses China as a model that you sort of longingly, I wish we could be more like that. And Tristan earlier put it that there's a kind of fascism here. There's certainly, or there's a different angle on the same thing, I think, that you or Tristan were responding to, which is there's an authoritarianism here. And there's a sympathy for Trump that comes up in the end of the book. That's and they're right that there's a real similarity, but that's a problem with their view, not a feature of their view. So they bring up, well, Trump, part of what he was activating to get elected in 2024 is he wants to bring back manufacturing to the U.S. He has a vision of like the way that the U.S. economy should work. We should have these goals, and we should build more. And they're about building, and Trump's about building. They disagree with how he's going about doing it, and some of the goal, like they would put, as Tristan said, like they're much more concerned in writing the book because of climate change. Trump is drill, baby, drill, and wants to do fossil fuel. Like that's a real problem. But it's not a problem that government is dictating all this. The problem is, well, it's dictating, let's have pro-fossil fuel things, that we should be having pro-renewable energy things. And so there's no questioning of the government's power to dictate this. And this is the longing for China is, yeah, they can dictate this, and we like a lot of their goals, because they mention over and over about like China's building high-speed rail, and they're into renewables and so on. And like, yeah, this is what we should be doing, and we should have a government that can more easily do this. Or take the immigration. They're not objecting to Trump and the Trump administration that they want to have drastic control over immigration. What they're objecting to is, no, we shouldn't really be restricting immigration. We need more H-1Bs because we need smart people to come here and work on renewables and things like that. But it's not immigration is about freedom versus controls. No, the government should control this, but it should control this for a different reason and for a different goal than what Trump is doing. And so they have a deep kinship with authoritarianism. And the China, they activate other governments than the U.S. Like I brought up France with in regard to nuclear power. They bring up Germany with renewables. They bring up Japan. But their longing focus, as you said, always goes to China. And that there's something really bad about that. Is if you can't hold, well, we should be more like Germany or France. No, we should be more like China. That is, you want the government to have massive control over people's lives so you can tell them what to do. And it's just, we're going to have some similar and some better goals than what the Chinese government has. And that you think, and this is that they obliterate the individual. You think your government should have this kind of control over individuals' lives and order them around because you don't really see the individuals and the costs on people's lives.
Yeah, Tristan, you brought up the China in the very beginning, the longing for China. So I want to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, it's a lot of the implications in this book are what I find disturbing and scary in terms of the authoritarianism, because it's often left implicit. So there's an admiration for China. There's constant references to, well, China can do this, China can do that, and then no discussion about the ways in which China utterly disregards individual rights. And then with the Marx reference, similarly, if all you have to say about Marx is, there's wisdom, he got some things wrong, but there's wisdom in what he said, I think that's extremely concerning, and quite damning, really, in terms of where they're willing to go. But what's strange about the book, in a sense, is that it's a lot of it is left very implicit, and in those regards, and I think that's, in a sense, not that surprising. It's been a feature of liberal ideology, I guess, for a long time, that the more authoritarian aspects of how they think about government, how government should operate, is they're afraid of embracing that wholeheartedly. They want to frame things as, we're solving problems together. But the more that you're looking up to, again, China as a model, it should raise a question of what's really motivating you, or what's the mechanism underlying your view in the background, is a type of authoritarianism. And so the fact that this book is getting a lot of praise, and that it has that feature, is extremely concerning, and quite depressing, I think.
Well, on that depressing note, I think it's a good point to wrap up. And at the beginning, I sort of tried to summarize or essentialize that the theme of the book was something like, and I think they should agree, that America is facing a self-inflicted scarcity due to underbuilding and overregulation, particularly in liberal governed areas, and the solution lies in the new abundance agenda. I think through this discussion, we figured out and pointed that agenda is the empowering of the government to have more control and restricted control in all the areas in our lives, from construction to healthcare to infrastructure to innovation and science, and in complete disregard of the individuals who are to build or to create the things in pursuit of the goals that Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein wish in their to see in their future, utopian future. So that's my basic take. And if you enjoyed this podcast and you want us to bring more of that, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings like this. Please like, comment, share this episode if you liked it. Consider doing it on other channels, not just YouTube, like Facebook. And if you have any questions or comments about today's episode, if you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read and all of your emails and reply to some. Thank you, Tristan. Thank you, Onkar, for joining me. See you next time.